We send you over in the name of the United States of America. You're coming home, one way or another, one way or another.
It comes back to that solemn obligation that we have to the families of doing our utmost to provide them the answers of what happened.
We have to get the public to be interested in this, not so much just as a tragedy that happened, but it's a tragedy that can be resolved.
You are not forgotten. They are not forgotten.
We must keep the promise alive.
As we honor our Korean War veterans, we must also remember the more than 7,900 Americans missing in action. I want you to know that the Department of Defense is dedicated to the search to identify and locate the remains of our fallen service members missing in action in Korea. We leave no one behind.
On June 1st, 1951, Air Force pilot Captain Harry Cecil Moore was shot down, landing in enemy territory during the Korean War. The Moore family had always believed that Harry was killed in action and lost his life while serving his country. But in 2002, documentation surfaced that changed their world. This is a story of young love, brotherly love, love that has withstood the test of time, yet all the while a question unanswered. What became of Captain Harry Cecil Moore? This is Harry's story, and about keeping the promise alive.
My name's Robert Moore, and my brother was Harry Moore. I was born in West Alexander, Pennsylvania, which is about 6 miles east of Wheeling, West Virginia. It was a little unusual in it. My parents were divorced when I was very young. My mother's name was Mildred, and she had a pretty tough life being separated from my father. Before and during the Depression, times were really tough, so she had a hard life, but she did the best she could for us. We had 2 other brothers, and 2 of us were sent to one of the grandparents, and the other 2 were sent to the other grandparents. Harry and I went to our maternal grandparents. They had a farm, and so therefore we were required to do a lot of work. We relied on each other because when times got tough, well, then we at least had somebody to share it with. At that time, our government, of course, was trying to excite us into patriotism and to do the best we could for the war effort. In West Virginia, for instance, why the young men, most of us, had learned to shoot rifles and hunt and shoot shotguns, and so they were very desirable. So anybody that enlisted from West Virginia was taken fairly quickly. Harry wasn't a pilot right away. He enlisted in 1942, and he was sent to Florida, and he was trained as an aerial gunner, which was a very hazardous job, sat in the back of a bomber and try to fend off the enemy. He was chosen then to go to radio school, and then was eligible for pilot's training, so he became then an aviation cadet. We had letters from him, but back and forth, and of course we'd all gather around and read it and see what was happening. October of 1944, and we got a telegram saying that he had been shot down and was considered to be missing in action. He was flying as an element leader for a squadron, and he was strafing the Japanese, trying to keep them from advancing on Kunming, China. And he was doing that when he was shot down.
I landed in a rice paddy right alongside the mountain. I landed on my shoulders but was not injured at all. The plane crashed about 50 yards from me and burned. I had to leave the parachute along with the pack, fearing the Japs were too nearby to stay. After getting out of the chute, I ran up a mountain where I found a small stream. I walked right up the middle of the stream because the grass covered me on both sides. I got to the top of the mountain, and the other men in the flight were still bombing and strafing. I lived in caves at night, and shells exploded every half hour during the day, and every 5 seconds during the night. I went down to a small grass hut at the bottom of the mountain, and there I found farmers. They called a small girl that could read Chinese. The mountain people, who are unable to read Chinese, are not too friendly. They don't seem to know the Americans are fighting for them. Some gave me rice to eat. I was also given Chinese clothes to wear. Mine were left in the mountains. I met the 93rd Chinese Army walking west. It had approximately 600 men. They were going to Yongning. With the soldiers, I ate dog meat and rice. I was shot at by Chinese, who, I believe, thought I was Japanese. The best treatment one gets is with the Chinese Army, so it is, in my opinion, best to stay with them if possible. 16 hours of walking was required each day. At Junkang, this Chinese army gave me 30 soldiers and a horse to take me to Sanchui. I sewed my pointy talkie, watch, ring, and wristband into my clothes. A colonel of the SOS picked me up and took me to Yichkang in a jeep. This was on December 16th, 1944.
After Harry was shot down, we had no knowledge of anything that happened. We were aware that he was missing in action, and of course that was heartbreaking. Finally, my mother got a telegram saying that he was probably killed. And that same day, we got a telegram from him saying he was safe.
Remarkably, after 51 days, Harry reached friendly territory. He was only 19 years old. This was the first time that Harry had been pronounced killed in action, but not the last.
I am Lois Moore, and I was married to Harry Moore. I first met Harry in 1946. That's when I graduated from high school, and he was back from World War II, and he was a good friend of my brother's. He had a lot of fun with him, but I think he had a very serious side to him. I considered him tall, and he had a ruddy complexion, very, very pretty curly brown hair, a nice smile, and just a nice man. He would come to our home, and my mother would do his laundry and pack lunch for him and things like that, because he was such a nice young guy. His family was very family-oriented around the grandparents' farm, where Bob and Harry grew up. I always went up to the farm and with the relatives when they were there, so we visited it a lot. We had gone together for quite a while, and then he had gone back into the service. Harry was quite handsome, very handsome, and when he had his uniform on and his wings, he looked very, very nice. I think he wanted to re-enlist. I think he missed being in the Air Force and what he had been doing, what he loved, even though he had the very bad experience. I think he was patriotic and wanted to become part of it again. He had re-enlisted as a sergeant, but then he found out he could get his commission back, his lieutenant's commission. So he went for that, and then he found out he was going to be transferred to the Philippines. Between the two of us, we got enough money together, and I went to San Francisco to see him before he left. And then we decided he's going to be gone 2 or 4 years, and we just decided to get married. So on the spur of the moment, we did. I was in the Philippines shortly before the Korean War started. I couldn't go there until he had gotten permission for government housing. It wasn't too long after World War II that we went to Clark Field. I was very, very far from home, but I had Harry there, and it worked out well for us. We had a baby, a little girl, and she was not older than maybe a week or 2 weeks when he was shipped up there to Japan and then into Korea.
My fellow citizens, at noon today, I sent a message to the Congress about the situation in Korea. We have sent land, sea, and air forces to assist in these operations. We have done this because we know that what is at stake here is nothing less than our security and the peace of the world.
Everyone that was left on the base was fearful. I was still there in the Philippines, and I received this telegram that said he had been killed in action. I was very, very distraught because there I was in this foreign land and a new little baby, and I wondered what was going to become of me. But then they reiterated quickly and said that it was all a mistake, that he hadn't even flown that day. So how that happened, I don't know, but he did come down to see me during that period of time because it was a very traumatic episode.
62 years ago, a terrible war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, massively assisted by the Soviet Union, launched a surprise attack on the South, threatening the very survival of South Korea. 21 countries around the world came to our rescue. The war lasted more than 3 years with the involvement of China, claiming millions of lives, including hundreds of thousands of service members. The United States made the greatest contribution and sacrifice to defend South Korea from the communist attack.
To me, it was such an unusual situation. Anytime our men go to war, it's fearful, especially for those left behind. And we knew that this squadron was going up there into South Korea, and we had no idea what activity they were going to get into or what resistance they would get. Harry knew what he was going to be getting into because he had been there in World War II.
I had a few letters from Harry. I corresponded with him when he was in the Philippines. He said he was going to Japan and then fly out of Japan into Korea, which he did.
I went back to the United States in 1950. I went back because Harry had been sent to Korea. I had no idea when he was coming back or what was going to take place there. He had his tour of duty, and I knew he would be there for a while. And so then I decided the best thing for me to do was to pack up and go back to West Virginia, which I did. And I think other wives did the same thing when their husbands left. There was no reason to stay there.
Harry, of course, married Lois. We found out that she had had a baby. The next thing that I knew was that Lois had moved back to West Virginia. And I, in the meantime, had gone to California.
Jana was about 2 months old when I returned to the United States with her, and my mother took care of her, and I went back to my old job.
We didn't have much correspondence then because it was pretty hard to have correspondence. But one day we got a telegram.
It was paper communication. Harry was missing in action, that he had gone out that day and was missing in action. And that was basically it.
Of course, when my brother Harry was shot down, and it went through our mind that this had happened before. But as time went on, it became less and less feasible that he could have survived. The fact that he was shot down in North Korea was not a good circumstance. We had heard about the torture and all the ill treatment they'd given all the prisoners, and so it was very disarming to us. I think it was about a year later that he hadn't been recovered and nothing else was known about him, and therefore he was presumed to be killed in action.
I think he looked forward to coming back to the United States, having a wife and a little girl, and I think he looked forward to having a good life with Lois, Jana, and Harry. Harry was 27 years old when he was shot down over Korea. It's really hard to explain that kind of a feeling. I was just a young girl, and Harry's daughter Jana was 15 months old. We knew he wouldn't be back. I just felt very, very sad.
When Mom and I came back to the States, I was, of course, very young, and I didn't know anything, and she was very strong. That whole part of that life kind of went away.
I started to feel in this little tiny town that people felt sorry for me. I knew so many of the people there. And my husband was killed, and I had this little baby, and so I just decided I had to make a different life for myself and get out of there. So I decided I was going to move to California. So I called my brother, who worked in Maryland at the time, and said that I wanted to say goodbye because I was going to go to California. And he just said, well, will you wait 2 weeks? I'd like to give my notification to my employer, and I want to go with you. So my brother and I and Jana went to California.
I just recall that we had a 1950 Ford, and we were going on an adventure. We're in another place, you know. But she was always extremely strong and was going to make it through no matter what.
My job in San Francisco required me to go to Los Angeles periodically, and I found out that Lois's brother Jack was living in LA, and I knew Jack much better than I knew Lois. So I looked Jack up, and I went over to visit, and there was Lois and her daughter. Lois was a very good cook, and so I would make periodic visits.
He's such a sweet man. He's really a tender man. He's always acting like he's silly and joking and so forth, but he's very, very sentimental and has really a soft heart.
We didn't talk much about Harry. We reminisced sometimes and expressed our sorrow. But you just about have to accept the reality of the fact that you're absolutely helpless as to what you can do about it and as to what anybody else can do about it. So therefore, you go on with your life, but you never forget it. It's always in the back of your mind. We really thought he was gone. I guess that one thing led to another. And in 1954, then, we were married.
I don't think he ever proposed to me. I don't think we ever even had a date or did anything. He would come on his job, would come to Southern California and work periodically, and he would stay with my brother and me at our house. And he did this quite a few times, and neither of us remember what happened. But all of a sudden we decided we were going to get married, so we took Jana and went to Las Vegas and went Got married at the Weekirk of the Heather. That was it.
I thought we were going to Death Valley. You know, like I said, adventures.
Jana really never knew Harry, but she knows he was her father. But she knows Bob's her father, too.
I was always treated as if I was his own daughter, and I was. Bob has always been my dad.
And then eventually, about 9 years later, Bob and I had a little girl, and they are just two darling sisters.
We were a very close-knit family. We did a lot of things together, always vacationing together.
I never felt like I was deprived of attention because we did spend a lot of time together as a family. We had lots of fun. It was kind of quirky.
I decided I'd go back to school. I became a chiropractor. I went to Los Angeles. Lois got a job and earned the money to put me through school. That was very hard. I was a little old for going to school, and it was a very difficult school, but we did it, and then we moved back to Hayward. I went into practice. We worked very hard and were very successful. I happened to have some ideas on how to improve different things in the medical profession, and gradually started a little business on the side, and it just got bigger and bigger. And of course, Lois and I worked together all the time, and as did our daughters, and we developed a very successful business. Dealers throughout the world, and therefore we traveled throughout the world, and both on pleasure and business, and we had a very happy, enjoyable life.
I think that, you know, my dad is kind of, he's the big thinker and the idea guy, and my mom is in a supporting role, and she's, you know, following behind and kind of filling in the gaps. So it's easy for them to kind of meld and mesh their ideas together. But I think at the end of the day, it's just, they just make a great team. We made a good life for our two girls. We did just about everything we could. We water skied, we had dune buggies, we had motorcycles, we snow skied, we had motorhomes. We did just about everything we could do to have them have an enjoyable life. And of course, it was a little bit selfish on our part because we enjoyed it too. Are we on candid camera?
He's provided a very good life for me and for them and for himself, and we've just had such a good life together.
Lois is just a wonderful wife, and anything I wanted to do in life, she said, when do we start? And the reverse was true also. So we just didn't have much disagreement all our life. Lois worked with me ever since we were married, and we've been together every day ever since.
My name is Christy Ann Gordon, and Bob and Lois are my grandparents, and Harry is my grandpa. When I was growing up, there was one of the portraits of Harry in our home. So Harry was always there, in a manner of speaking. I was 21 years old. I bought my first house. I was scared. I lived in a third-floor walk-up. I used to lock the door time and time again. About 2 weeks into this very just terrified at night feeling, I felt someone sit on my bed, very much so right next to my feet. And I can remember sitting straight up and staring into something and yet nothing, and have this sensation that everything is okay. And I looked and I said, "Oh, it's you." And I knew it was someone I recognized, and I laid back down and I went to sleep, and I never had another night in that house where I was uncomfortable. It awakened a search within me, and I really wanted to know who Harry was and find out about him.
I'm not surprised that she became involved because she is a very proactive, very energetic person who's also very family-oriented.
If we're not in the room picking on each other, it's not genuine.
I think she originally looked on the internet for the 67th Fighter Bomber Squadron, of which Harry, her grandfather, was a member.
I found my grandfather's colonel, Colonel Bud Beitman, who was now living in Arizona. It's quite presumptuous, but I called him on the phone and I said, "Hi, you don't know me, but my grandfather was Harry Cecil Moore." And he was sharp as a tack. He knew who I was immediately. I said, "I'm looking for information." And he said, "Let me tell you about your grandfather." He told me about how Lois and Harry were just like gems on Clark Air Force Base. How because the women couldn't travel off the Air Force Base, they had dances and events and dinners, and that Harry and Lois were just this wonderful couple that everyone loved. They were fun to be around. He emailed me pictures of Harry in front of his plane, which I didn't know was named the Lois Lee, after my grandmother. So I called them both, and it was a very tearful conversation where I said, I don't know how you're going to deal with this, but I needed to know, and I didn't want to ask you because I didn't want to hurt you. So I did this, and here's who I talked to, and here's what I have for you, and I hope you like it.
I was surprised that she had taken an interest in Harry's situation, and of course I was pleasantly surprised.
If your loved one is killed, it's a very personal issue where the very least you can do is honor them and bring them home. And when you don't have a casket, and you don't have a ceremony, and you don't have closure, and how I think back to how tormenting that must have been to my grandmother to not know the answer, especially in the initial stages of the early 50s when she finally did remarry and she had to make the choice to move on with her life. So we were kind of stitching together our own closure as a family.
We were doing very well, and we had sold our business, and we retired then to Idaho. And we had a little farm and a vineyard, and we were having a good time. But in 2002, we received a letter.
I remember how we were both so shocked. I think Bob and I had been married 48 years, and we received this notice from the Department of the Air Force that Harry probably was not killed.
They had discovered information that quite possibly Harry wasn't killed, but was captured and sent to Russia. The names and the places and the times and everything was very accurate and very detailed. Of course, that was very unsettling to us, hopeful, but since it had been so many years, we didn't know what to do,
I really had to think again about what this meant. I could have two dads, or do I have cousins, or do I have relatives in another country?
It was something for us to look forward to and hope maybe he was alive somewhere. Yet we thought, well, here we're married. What have we done?
A lot of questions flooded my mind immediately. What did happen to him, and was he injured, and was he taken away somewhere, and was he treated well? And the biggest question was, could he still be alive?
And that was just like a curveball came out of nowhere.
Our quest then became one of trying to find out what happened to him, and in addition to that, what could be done about all the others that were missing and quite possibly had been captured and sent somewhere or hadn't been properly accounted for.
Americans may be surprised to know that there are nearly 8,000 servicemen from the Korean War alone who remain unaccounted for. In 1993, the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, DPMO, was established to oversee and manage POW MIA issues from past and current conflicts.
We are charged with oversight and policy of locating service members from as far back as World War II. It includes those who were prisoners of war or missing personnel from those conflicts. And about 600 people accomplish this mission daily.
We're here to tell you generally what the government is doing to account for missing folks and to address your specific question on your loved one's loss.
Folks are actually astounded by what the government is still doing. Some of them have no idea. It's been lore within their family, handed down from generation to generation, that their uncle, great-uncle, grandfather was in this conflict and went missing and never came home. They maybe see a photo in a dining room somewhere and they're told the story.
Collecting every little bit of information that we can.
It's a story rather than a known fact. So to come here and see it on paper and to see that somebody still cares and that somebody still wants to bring them home is extremely emotional for them.
Various agencies within the DPMO are faced with the daunting task of search, rescue, recovery, and remains identification throughout the globe.
Identifying remains is a very important project, and it's very important to those who were actually killed and they're trying to locate the remains. It's a very important thing to those families, and I'm very happy about that. But there are also others who were not killed or just missing, and the information is lacking, and we are unable to find out any more information.
The prisoner of war system in the U.S. government has recovered the remains of many prisoners, and I think that's great. They work their rear ends off to find the remains and bring them home, and I applaud all those people. However, I do not believe the job of the U.S. prisoner of war apparatus should be simply recovering bodies of people we already know are dead. We want to know about the guys who were alive in enemy hands and never came home, or guys who simply just disappeared at a time when we know the Soviets were collecting Americans. It is absolutely inadequate, and I think would be surprising to the American people.
One other very interesting component of this mission is the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission, whereby the United States and Russia would cooperate in trying to determine what happened to their various lost servicemen.
In collaboration with the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission, analysts from the Joint Commission Support Directorate, JCSD, were assigned to conduct research in Russia on missing U.S. servicemen. Interviews were conducted with more than 1,000 former Soviet veterans of the Korean War. And through these interviews, JCSD intelligence uncovered information about Captain Harry Cecil Moore.
I think that they stumbled onto the information in the archives, the Russian archives. I'm not sure what they were looking for, but at least somehow one of the investigators found in the archives reference to Harry, and I don't think that was a specific effort to find him. It was an effort to find out anything about the possibility of prisoners of war being sent to Russia or anything else that happened to them. There were actually 4 investigators who found these Russian pilots. 2 former Soviet pilots were interviewed on separate occasions. They stated that they were involved in the dogfight and that they had shot down a P-51. And the P-51 was still under control, landed gently in the water. Subsequently, they learned, and this is each of them being interrogated individually, they learned that a Captain Harry or Gary Moore was captured, was interrogated by Colonel Ivan Kozadub, and was subsequently, they learned, sent to Moscow. There's no H in Russian, so the Russians would pronounce Harry as Gary. Now, to find Russian pilots who on separate occasions knew the name and who knew the whole story, it would be beyond any logical explanation to think that this didn't happen. It obviously happened. When they found that information, they had a duty, an obligation to notify us of this, and they did that. And from then on, we haven't been able to get them to do anything else.
I defy any person to review the available evidence and not be entirely convinced that Americans were kept by the communists after the Korean War. How about the fact that the U.S. government asked the Russians to give our POWs back? Or how about the fact that the Air Force's top general, the year after the Korean War, asked the CIA to conduct covert operations to recover our prisoners that were being held by the communists? There is absolutely no doubt that our prisoners were held by the communists. There is doubt about how many, exactly who they were, could they still be alive, how many of them were in North Korea, China, or Russia. But anyone who tells you that there's no evidence they were held is not telling you the truth or doesn't know the evidence.
Be aware that the Chinese Air Force operated freely over North Korea, but the Soviet Air Force, Soviet pilots flying Soviet aircraft with either Chinese or North Korean markings, was also heavily involved and indeed flew the majority of the enemy's combat sorties. Partially for reasons of discretion and secrecy, and a large Soviet presence that's there, and yet not acknowledged at the time.
We often wondered why Harry might have been captured and sent to Russia. What interest would the Russians have in Harry? Harry had been trained in an F-80 plane, which was a plane that was developed to try to offset the advantages that the MiG had. Our propeller-driven planes that Harry was flying were no match for the MiGs. However, the Russians may have thought that Harry knew more about incoming F-86s, which were the next step up, in which they were a good match for the MiGs.
The men that I have learned about who were Americans who have never returned are the best of their generation. They're the best of the best, and that's one reason that many of them were picked and kept, in my estimate, based on the declassified intelligence. Because they had skills, because they were superb pilots, because they were leaders, because they resisted the communists. That's why they were kept.
If our men were taken as prisoners of war by Soviet forces, did Harry and others become political pawns or lucrative bargaining chips for the former Soviet Union Communist Party? Did they perish in camps known as the Soviet Gulag system? Or did they live out their lives behind an iron curtain simply as a means of survival?
A prisoner of war tends to move through both time and space, from point of capture to an initial holding point, to a march route often night by night, staying by villages and day, to a major holding point, to an interrogation camp, and finally, in most cases, to the permanent Chinese camps on the south bank of the Yalu River. The man's life in captivity literally becomes a movement. He meets people, he leaves people behind, he sees people, people see him.
Occasionally, some of these guys were, in heroic sense, kept lists of guys they saw in the camps and maybe did not make it, or maybe did make it. I saw this guy, he was alive.
Harry's name was not on the other list. Was discovered. There was no record of him ever being captured other than the information we got from the Russian archives.
Unlike some other men, many other men, he did not make it into mainstream captivity. And he's among men about whom we have open questions.
We have stopped the shooting. That means much to the fighting men and their families. And it will allow some of the grievous wounds of Korea to heal. Therefore, I am thankful. The task now is to put the ceasefire agreement into full effect and get down to working out an enduring settlement of the Korean problem. I cannot find it in me to exult in this hour. Rather, it is a time for prayer, that we may succeed in our difficult endeavor to turn this armistice to the advantage of mankind.
When Armistice Day happened in 1953, anyone who wasn't there and it wasn't accounted for was automatically classified as KIA, killed in action, when in fact that wasn't entirely accurate.
There was a Missing Persons Act of 1942. It was updated for Korea, and the basic rule was if a man had been missing for a year and a day, he could be declared legally dead for lack of a better alternative.
We've had testimony in front of Congress by men who were in charge of this and worked with the president at the time, and they said, you know, there are guys there. And he had to make the decision, and I don't blame him for this. He had to start World War III to get these guys back.
At that time, given the tensions of the Cold War, given that nuclear war sometimes seemed close, given the fact that we couldn't really get them back, that there was an argument to keeping it classified and doing whatever we could behind the scenes to recover these men. Keeping the existence of U.S. POWs in the Soviet Union secret is understandable. Giving up on them, writing them off, is indefensible. And that's what happened.
They took all the records and they filed them away. All classified documents of an amazing array of information, from prisoner debriefings, defectors reports, that all got buried. In those records are many accounts of what happened to guys.
The Korean War, often referred to as the Forgotten War, ended on July 27, 1953. Yet it would be decades before government leaders would acknowledge that American servicemen may have been taken captive by the Soviet Union regime. While met with skepticism, history was made in 1992 when a highly unlikely source spoke to the media and admitted that American prisoners of war did pass through Soviet hands. Days later, he addressed the United States Congress, then Russian President Boris Yeltsin.
We are firmly resolved not to lie anymore, either to our negotiating partners, or to the Russian, or American, or any other people. There will be no more lies, ever.
Это касается экспериментов с бактериологическим оружием.
The same applies to biological weapon experiments and the facts that have been revealed about American prisoners of war. The archives of the KGB and the Communist Party's Central Committee are being opened. Moreover, we are inviting the cooperation of the United States and other nations to investigate these dark pages.
Обещаю вам,
I promise you that each and every document in each and every archive will be examined in order to investigate the fate of every American unaccounted for. As President of Russia, I assure you that even if one American has been detained in my country and can still be found, I will find him. I will get him back to his family.
At that time, there was a coalition, a partnership taking place between our government and the Russian government, where information was becoming declassified.